Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we take a look at the decision by Israel to prevent the European Union from taking part in Israel-Palestine peace process. We'll also report on the attempted arson attack on London's Finsbury Park Mosque. But first, world leaders from over 150 countries have been in Paris to agree on a global approach to reduce CO2 emissions and halt climate change. Our reporter, Anisa Omar, has this.
Over the weekend, ahead of the climate change conference, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide marched to demand action on the issue. The meeting hosted 150 heads of states, including President Obama and David Cameron, who are expected to make some significant decisions during their short stay. Negotiators from 195 countries are attempting to agree on how to reduce global carbon emissions, as a part of a plan of a group of 20 countries, including the US, France and India, who will seek to double their investment in clean energy research over 5 years. Entrepreneurs Bill Gates and Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg are also expected to invest into low-cost clean energy projects from 2020. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon says he's reasonably optimistic about the meeting and stated climate change is a global phenomenon that requires leaders to invest wisely to boost their national economy. Some feel the need to address climate change is not only a moral duty but also a religious one for the 1.6 billion Muslims across the globe. Back in September, Islamic leaders issued a call to Muslims towards phasing out greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and a 100% renewable energy strategy. The Grand Muftis of Lebanon and Uganda endorsed the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change, along with prominent Islamic scholars and teachers from 20 countries. They particularly called on the well-off nations and oil-producing nations to lead the way in phasing out the greenhouse gas emissions and supporting poorer countries in doing so. Poorer countries saying they fear being left behind in the push for a new treaty. The impact of climate change on developing Muslim-majority countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia and Somalia has been devastating, such as floods, droughts and even cyclones becoming commonplace. Following the recent Paris attacks, security has been tight ahead of the conference, with police locking down the conference centre. Security fears were compounded given the arrest of 200 Parisian climate change demonstrators over the weekend, some of whom were protesting against France's state of emergency and not the conference. It is hoped by the UN that high-level appearances will boost the chances of reaching a deal to cut emissions. It will be the turning point, which is what the world requires. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius says it will be a turning point, which is what the world requires. Observers will be keen to learn if his optimism is matched by the conference's results. Anisa Omar, The Report.
Now, joining me in the studio to discuss all that is London Assembly member Murad Qureshi, who believes that Middle Eastern countries should be doing more to reduce CO2 emissions. And on Skype, Ferrial Adam, who's the Africa and Arab World team leader for 350.org. And we've also got Lotifa Begum, who has just returned from Paris, where she's handed in the Muslim Climate Change Action UK statement to the Convention on Climate Change. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Murad, first of all, these conventions, they come, they go. It doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. Is this any different, this one?
You're right. I've been watching them since the 90s in my student days. I do think, actually, the important emphasis here is the relationship between the developed and developing world. We're going to hear a lot today in the next few hours, probably, from leaders of the developing world, that the developed world hasn't quite matched up to the claim that they were going to do to reduce their CO2 emissions.
Ferrial, let me ask you the same question. Is this convention going to make very much difference?
Well, I must agree with the previous speaker that I've also been watching them in my early student days in the early 90s, and we've seen very little progress up until now. We also, for me, one of my concerns is that we had a lot of hype around the COP15 that was held in Copenhagen in 2009, and we came out with nothing from that negotiation. So we have to wait and see. The thinking is that there'll be a little bit of commitment, a little bit of moving forward, but I don't think fundamentally no.
Okay, and Lotifa, let me just ask you, that's two pretty kind of sceptical views here. What do you think?
I'd like to provide a more optimistic view, I guess, having just returned from Paris over the weekend where, we know this just yesterday, more than 50,000 civil society, members came out and marched on the streets. And I think that's what could make COP21 different to the previous COP, potentially. And we've been told that this is the last chance, essentially, for countries and governments to commit what is needed to keep global warming within 2 degrees. And I think that hopefully with that public pressure, countries and governments can be committed to make deals and promises that they would keep this time, as opposed to Copenhagen, where we know it was it's a failed agreement.
Now, Murad, you've been making the argument, and so have others, that that countries outside the Western advanced countries should do more and probably could do more. But there's an obvious objection and a serious one, which I heard a representative of the Indian government put only the other day, which is to say to the Western governments, hey, you guys, you've industrialised. This looks like you're trying to pass the buck and stop us industrialising. Now, is that fair criticism? How do you respond to that?
Well, I actually think that India is quite right to say that, and I'm sure Mr. Modi will say that when he gets on the platform sometime today. Now, I know he's not the best friend of a lot of Muslims who are watching this programme, but I do defend his right to defend Indians' right to admit as much as they may require to achieve a decent standard of living, which means water, transport, having energy to supply their homes. India's a long way from that, and if it sees fit to use coal to get there, I'm not sure those of us in the developed world should be trying to restrict that.
Ferrial, how do you think that contradiction needs to be dealt with? Because in a way, it's even worse than this, isn't it? Because if we take into account carbon trading, the advanced countries are basically offloading the climate problem into the less developed world.
I mean, I think that for me, I do think that there needs to be a common but differentiated responsibility between developed and developing countries. But having said that, I do think that developing countries also need to play a role and have some responsibility. So, for example, countries like India, South Africa are planning to build new coal-fired power station. Egypt's planning to build a new coal-fired power station. And we're saying, why do we have to build new ones when we can actually feed the electricity with renewable energy? And when you talk about development and how, whether this stopping that kind of coal infrastructure would stop development and economic growth and industrialization as you use it, I think we need to discuss what kind of industrialization are we looking at. And what we've seen in the developing world is an industrialization that keeps poor people poor, and it creates a bigger divide between rich and poor. And if you look at the mining areas where they're actually working on coal mines, those jobs are just not sustainable and should not be a picture of what should be development or industrialization. And so I think when we're looking at coal, we need to look beyond just the providing of electricity, but also in terms of health, water, air pollution, and sustainable jobs. And if we look globally as well, the coal industry in particular is on a decline. And, just in South Africa, they've lost something like 27,000 jobs since April 2015 in the mining sector. So we need to relook at what we mean when we say we want industrialization. And there are better ways to do things without stopping it. But having said that, we are saying it has to be a just transition. So you can't switch off coal tomorrow. We know that. But we're saying, let's not do more new ones. And I think we can get away with not doing more new ones.
Lotifa, do you think that we can have a different model of industrial growth, which is kind of environment friendly? I mean, after all, the things that we associate with industrialization, indeed the things that are taking place, if we look at China or India, do tend to be extractive industries, do tend to be heavy industries, do tend to be the most polluting industries.
think one of the key things that we are calling for, particularly in the Muslim Climate Action Group, is to switch to renewable sources of energy, and looking at ways to do that is crucial, and both for developing countries and the developed countries. Although arguably developed countries have greater resources that they can contribute. I know for first-hand, seeing myself in Bangladesh, the impact of industrialization on the most poorest and vulnerable communities, which Islamic Relief is helping on the ground. We know that there needs to be a lot more done. We know in Copenhagen there was a pledge of $100 billion, dollars, and that climate financing is needed. And I think that there are alternative, solutions and innovative projects that exist, which can be drawn on, and models, solar-powered, energies, drawing on those. And that's really crucial for us if we're going to help improve lives and help families and communities become more sustainable.
Murad, what about this question? Because, Ferrial is pointing to something which we'd all like to see happen, that wouldn't penalise, non-industrialised countries for industrialising, but would require them, or would look for a model by which they could do that in a non-polluting way. Is that available? Is that model available?
Well, there is obviously looking at the model itself, but I think in this conference, climate change conference, we've also got to look at not just the agreement about reductions in CO2 emissions per capita, per person, but also clearly transfers of technology and assistance. And I think if those two things aren't discussed, I think you're going to see people like the Indians, the Brazilians and the South Africans leaving the table. If we're going to help India move beyond coal dependency, we've got to show them investment in renewables and show them the access to the technology transfers required. For example, it was only last week we shot our £1 billion programme on storing carbon emissions from coal in the ground. That's the kind of technology that they'll need access to, and if there is a bargain to be done, that's the way to do it. But at the moment, none of that's on offer, and neither is the assistance. And very often, actually, the reality of aid has been that when the offers are made, they don't actually materialise.
Ferrial, let's just see if we can explore this a bit further, because, obviously you're pointing towards a solution that we'd all like to see happen, but then when you stand back from it and you look at the scale of industrialisation that's still going on, there's one figure that China is building a city the size of Rome every 2 years. With that scale of development, is there a model which could be environmentally friendly?
Well, I think that it's not going to be entirely environmentally friendly, but I think we can move towards having better ways of doing that. I do think that there are elements of it that can actually be much more sustainable. Having said that, China has been building these cities, and it's it might be not building as much and ending up with white elephants, so to speak. And I do think that for me, I think it takes political will. And right now we don't have that. So if you look, for example, you're giving me the China example, I can tell you, what about Germany, which has gone in the last 10 years, has increased the amount of renewable energy that it uses far more than anyone expected. And that is an industrialized country, and they use a lot more electricity than most other small countries do. And so if they can do that, and if they could provide so much of electricity through renewable energy, then I don't see why we can't do that for developing countries.
Okay, Lotifa, sorry, Murad, do you want to say something?
Can I just say something in defence of the Chinese? No society in the whole of human history has been able to take 500 million people out of acute poverty as the Chinese communists have in China. And they're also the biggest investors in renewable energy. The reason why solar panel prices have dropped considerably is because the Chinese have made considerable investment. And I think that's the way we're going to have to go. But that lead isn't coming from the developed world. It's actually coming from those who are going to be leading the developing world. And I think it's time at these conferences we began listening to them more so than we do to ourselves. Because actually the Americans have made quite clear, whatever agreement that is put on the table, they're not, if it's a legal one, they're not signing up.
Lotifa, do you think nations in the Muslim world have a role to play here in terms of providing some of that political will?
Absolutely. I think, we know that from our work in countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Muslim communities and countries are being affected, greatly by climate change. And if we are to make any progress, we need to put more funding into prevention and resilience building. And Muslim countries, especially the Gulf states, have got the funding and resources to be able to contribute to that. It is a matter of political will, though, and this is very much the reason why we need to put pressure on, the Gulf states as well as other Muslim countries that are developed and have the resources to, commit to delivering on their promises. And we're very much hoping for that with the launch of the Islamic Climate Change Declaration, which took place in Istanbul in August. We were calling on, Muslim religious clerics to engage with environment ministers, and we're hoping very much in the next few days at COP21 that, we can ensure some strong commitments are made.
Ferrial, I mean, we're all pretty agreed then that there's a kind of missing element of political will to get this stuff done. Where do you think it's going to come from? Is it going to come from the kind of conferences that we're seeing at the moment? These are heads of state. They're, as we know, very heavily lobbied and tied to the biggest of the corporations. Is it going to come from there, or is it going to come from outside that political setup?
Well, I don't have much view that it's going to come from inside and from the negotiations itself. I mean, there could be some steps forward, as I said before, but I think the main change is going to come from the outside and from people on the ground, whether they're working at local government level or with civil society. I think that is where we're going to see a lot more change in terms of what we want, for fossil fuels. But also, I think that we cannot ignore the fact that globally the economics are also saying that we need to start investing outside of, stop investing in fossil fuels, because economically we're ending up with stranded assets. And so that is also going to, I think, in some way or another influence the tide changing and for us to move to a more renewable energy sector, because we just cannot do anything else, I think, right now, actually. If we look at how expensive it is to actually use coal and to mine for coal in many countries. That's just one example.
Murad, where do you think the sort of political energy for this is going to come from? Is it going to have to hurt people more than it's hurting at the moment? Is the climate change movement going to have to become more radical than it is at the moment?
You're probably right there, John. But I also see some change which I would like to see. I mean, at the moment, the Conference of the Parties are nation states. The reality is we've reached a kind of unique point in human history. There are more people living in cities now than out in the villages, and that's where 75% of the CO2 emissions are coming from. There are many cities that do want to step up to the mark and lead the way on this. Maybe soon in the future we should have city-states like London, New York, Paris, others in China and South Asia prepared to sign up to it and make commitments, because I actually think there's a major role for cities to play in this in the future, because that's where the problem is, that's where the solutions are, and that's certainly something I would like to see in a London and a future mayor doing that here. For example, the energy take of cities is something which a mayor could do substantially. We could move towards 100% clean energy by 2050 in London, from the sole basis that actually the biggest consumer of energy is transport for London. If they bought up all the community energy supplies, that will be a massive move forward and brought in renewable energy. There are things that can be done, but I don't think actually solely concentrating on the national state level is the be-all and end-all, given where we are now in human history.
Lotifa, I mean, in Paris, the climate change demonstration was, of course, banned because of the state of emergency following the Paris attacks. Do you think that diminished the impact of the protests on the conference?
Well, we actually think that yesterday with more than 50,000 people turning out for marches around the world, and more than 20,000 shoes being laid down in Paris, where they couldn't march, was a very powerful, call from civil society about the fact that their voices can't be ignored. And despite the recent attacks, I think there's still very much, from what I gathered when I was in Paris, a strong sense of solidarity amongst people of faith, because climate change is a common issue of social justice. And I think that we will see at the end of COP as well more creative ways that people will be expressing the need for climate justice. Governments may be able to stop people from, protesting on the streets, but they can't stop them from having their voices heard. And we saw that through the global marches that took place in key cities yesterday.
Ferrial, what do you think about that? Do you think that it was a setback for the climate change movement not to be able to protest in the same kind of numbers that they would have done without that state of emergency?
I think that is disappointing, and for all the people who have been working on that, it's a big march. It's a big time to come out and make your voices heard. But what has actually been a positive from this is, exactly as Lotifa said, was that globally the voices just came up. There was a call saying this march will not be happening anymore in Paris. We need people around the world to just take this on and to build from it. And I think if we look at the number of people, you're looking at almost 700,000 people around the world marched over this last weekend. And that is a significant amount of people who are coming together on one particular issue over a weekend. So while, yes, we were disappointed by not being able to march in Paris, what this did is it amplified the voices around the world for a lot of people who would not have been able to make it to Paris anyway, and who are living the impacts of climate change.
OK, Ferrial Adam, Murad Qureshi here in the studio, Lotifa Begum on the phone. Thanks very much for that discussion, but I'm afraid it's all we've got time for. We'll take a short break.